our presenter. Glenn Pearce-Oroz is currently the regional team leader for the Water and Sanitation Program in Latin America and the Caribbean. He has over 17 years of experience working in the sector in Central America, Bolivia, Peru, Chile, as well as South Asia. That's, by the way, where I first met Glenn, in Bangladesh, when he was heading the team there. Glenn has been active in creating opportunities for the Water and Sanitation Program to contribute to evidence-based policy reform in different countries. He has also been working to develop regional learning platforms that connect water supply and sanitation stakeholders around innovative approaches for supporting sustainable services. So, Sujun, will you now please take away my slides and bring out Glenn's presentation? And Glenn, I'm turning the microphone over to you and going on mute. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Elizabeth, and good morning to everyone from Lima, Peru. I would like to first off appreciate perhaps if Joy could let me know if the volume is okay with my mic while I start into this presentation. I'd like to perhaps start with a bit of a background on how we came about this exercise for identifying the challenges in rural water supply and sanitation in Latin America over the next decade. It happens that in 1999 there was a learning event here in Peru on improving the sustainability of water and sanitation projects in rural areas. And this served as a snapshot for what were some of the challenges that were being faced at that time regarding the sustainability of rural water supply and sanitation. In 2010 then, 10 years later, we had the opportunity of convening an additional learning exercise which involved approximately 55 participants from up to 15 different countries in Latin America. And so this is why we sometimes refer to this as Cusco plus 10, because it gave us the opportunity to not only understand what has been some of the progress made in Latin America in rural water supply and sanitation, but also what are some of the issues or what are some of the pending issues or challenges left to be undertaken. So this is where we have landed in terms of identifying these challenges in Latin America for the next decade. I think this helps us to focus our efforts on some of the more structural issues that are involved or that will affect the delivery of services in rural areas. But I'm also cognizant that this, for people who work in other developing countries in other regions, it may also give them a peek into the future as far as where the challenges lie once a great deal of the access challenges are resolved. And in Latin America, as most of us know, certainly growth has been very important. Economic growth has been very important. But there is still a need to address inequity in services, inequity in many dimensions in the region. And so where we're at is we're now starting to focus on the hardest to reach in terms of water supply sanitation. And in addition to focusing on the hardest to reach, we also recognize that it's not only about access but also about sustainable services. So these are issues that many of us have dealt with as we work in the sector. But here we do have a laboratory in Latin America where we're starting to work through some of these important issues. Let me then get to the first slide of the presentation, and I'll try to keep this to about 20-25 minutes so that we do have enough time for a good discussion. And just quickly doing a quick overview of the region, in particular just to lay down some markers regarding what the context is in Latin America, before going into where rural services stand, both the snapshot in 1990, 10 years later, what are some of the trends that we've observed, as well as some of the challenges over the next decade. Let me start then by making the reflection that from the outside, Latin America oftentimes appears to be quite homogeneous. Once you get closer, you realize certainly that this is not the case. There are not only middle-income countries, but also low-income countries, as well as fragile and vulnerable systems. Latin America, nevertheless, continues to be one of the most urbanized regions in the developing world, but that regional average also hides some important differences within countries. Here we see certainly the trend in terms of distribution between urban and rural areas over the past 40 years. And it's important to note that there's still 120 million or so people living in rural areas in the region. But some countries certainly have much higher levels of rural population, closer to 50%. And these are some of the countries in Central America that come to mind. So there has been, there is, and there will be a population in rural areas that need to benefit or need to avail from sustainable services. If we look then into the different income groups that we have in Latin America, we note that certainly there's been very good movement, very important movement in terms of poverty reduction. But again, regional averages can also hide some important realities. And there's still a number of countries where poverty rates are above 50%. In terms of income inequality, I think this is a very telling snapshot of a sample of countries. And these are Gini coefficients for a handful of countries. And certainly the closer you get to one, the more income inequality exists. And it's important to note here that not one country from Latin America is below 0.4, and 16 out of the 30 highest, 16 out of the 30 countries with highest inequality are here in this region. And so we're starting to see now, with this point, we're starting to make more relevant the point of the inequitable distribution of income in the region, which is a common theme that I'll come back to towards the end of the presentation as well. If we turn our attention to basic services in rural areas, we can also see some important progress, some important advances. In 1990, 63% of the population in rural areas availed of improved access to improved drinking water sources. In 2000, that went up to 72%. In 1990, if the focus was on improving coverage, and this also speaks to some of the points that our colleague Richard Carter made in last week's presentation, how the focus has been on outputs. There was little or no information on quality of services. In this time frame, we also see the proliferation of social investment funds, which were designed as mechanisms to channel any number of rural infrastructure projects, including but not limited to water supply and sanitation in rural areas. So the coverage had improved through the year 2000, but certainly not enough. Large rural populations had been without access to or continue to be without access to improve drinking water and basic sanitation. And certainly there continue to be sustainability problems. Access in year 1 does not equal access necessarily in year 5 or 6, as numerous studies have demonstrated. And so in 1999, what happened was the at the end of this learning event that was organized by the World Bank and the Water and Sanitation Program in Cusco on how do we improve sustainability of water and sanitation projects in rural areas, there were 6 important lessons or 6 important recommendations that came up. We need not only to focus on works, but also comprehensive and multidisciplinary approaches in terms of rural water supply and sanitation. National and financial policies are certainly needed to provide the guidance that's necessary and common principles that are helpful in making sure that rural areas receive the support that they need for these types of investments. Community participation certainly is something that has been increasingly recognized as important throughout the project cycle and beyond in terms of operation and maintenance. But also the service providers of goods and services, recognizing their role at different points throughout the project cycle. In terms of pre-investment, the recommendation was not only to focus on technical viability, but also to include demand and understand better what that demand is saying, and we have some examples later on that reflect the importance of listening to the demand in different rural areas. And certainly long-term operation requires improved management skills. So those were the 6 recommendations that came out of our analysis, our joint analysis with many partners in 1999. In this first decade of this century, 4 major developments that I'd like to highlight have been evident. The first being that this demand-based approach certainly has been validated and is now less and less questioned, and is the methodology de rigueur for works in for investments in rural water supply sanitation. We're adopting increasingly longer-term outlooks, and so if we haven't resolved this issue of the sustainability, we're at least looking towards different options for getting on the right track. It's important to note that there's a greater attention, there's been a greater attention on the comprehensive management of water, including not only water resources, but also multiple uses or productive uses of water, and how that is coordinated with drinking water supply. And the fourth big development that I'd like to highlight is the importance of sanitation, and the recognition that sanitation continues to lag, and the importance for addressing improved sanitation in rural areas. So this is becoming more and more relevant, more and more of an issue as we discuss rural water supply and sanitation. Just very quickly, these are the trends: 1990, 2000, 2010. This comes from JMP, and again, we see improvements. However, we also still see areas where important numbers of populations are still without access, in particular with regards to improved sanitation. Where do we go from here? From here, we are looking at 5 main challenges over the next decade. And these 5 main challenges are focused on the sustainability of rural sanitation, the demand-based approach beyond the project cycle, being recognized as a useful approach to develop projects, but we now need to think beyond the project cycle. The importance of decentralization and municipalities and the role that municipalities can play in terms of providing the supportive context to different rural systems. The issue of sector policy and financial policy continues to be a challenge that we noted as we did this reflection over the past 10 years and started looking forward. And certainly long-term sustainability of services, and we'll get to some of those points in a couple of minutes. Let me start with the sustainability of rural sanitation, the first main challenge as we look forward to the next 10 years. If in 2010 the regional access to improved sanitation was at 60%, we still need to recognize that there are many countries and important populations that are still without access to improved sanitation. And these 6 countries, which do have less than 50% of their rural populations with access to improved sanitation. So this is one of the main challenges that we need to address. There has been certainly more of an effort to recognize the importance of software going into communities with both software, public education, behavior change methodologies, in addition to the hardware. And there has also been a recognition of the need to be flexible in the different approaches and give families, give households the chance to choose among different solutions. And in this respect, we have a good example here in Ecuador on the compact sanitary unit, which was an initiative of the government of Ecuador through its Pearce-Oroz program, where the government essentially financed 70% of the investment cost. The communities financed 30% of the investment cost. And the importance here was the role that the municipality played during the implementation of the Pearce-Oroz project. What I'd like to highlight is that 7 years later, an almost universal functionality of these different sanitary units, and certainly this is a testament to part of the front-end work that was done in terms of fitting the supply with the demand. This was a risk for the government, but certainly that risk was taken because of the expectations that were being communicated by the rural populations. There's been a higher level of service that was able to be combined with a progressive financing policy, as well as the participation of beneficiaries from the beginning. In the long run, this is reducing additional costs to them. So the recommendations in terms of rural sanitation have to do with these 6 main points. The regulatory framework with a comprehensive vision is lacking in many of our countries. This idea of availing beneficiaries or availing households of different options is gaining increasing traction, but needs to be moved forward more aggressively. There's the importance of promoting the adoption of low water use sanitation technologies is increasingly important in water-stressed areas in the region. And certainly there's a role for private sector participation that is becoming more evident in terms of rural sanitation. Let me keep moving and go to the second of the 5 main challenges, which addresses the demand-based approach, but looking at it beyond the project cycle. And the demand-based approach as part of the project cycle, as I mentioned earlier, has now gained quite a bit of currency and acceptability in the different projects that we see. However, there have been certain limitations to this process, and some of them are listed here. One of the needs that we're seeing, however, and this is why the analysis and the reflection around this demand-based approach is pushing us to think beyond the project cycle, is what happens post-construction of systems and post-construction of hardware. There is the need for increased local capacities to make these systems more sustainable, and therefore there is a need for the different support networks to be, again, increasingly focused on the demand and adjusting to that demand. And I'd like to illustrate this point by way of the example from Brazil and the integrated system of rural sanitation, CSAS, which in the state of Ceará is an excellent example of how the different communities that are now operating their systems receive support from a federation of different community groups and different boards, rural water boards, that are connected through this system of CSAT. And the important point here is that CSAT is not only this confederation of different water boards, but also is supported by the state water utility. And so this platform of rural systems helps in the sustainability, helps the water boards in their sustained management of their systems. But again, the point here, and I'd like to again draw a linkage with the discussion that we had last week with Richard Carter's myths of rural water supply and sanitation. Communities cannot always manage their facilities on their own, which is one of the myths that Richard brought out. And this is precisely a good illustration of how that's being addressed by the support of the state water utility as well as municipalities. So to think beyond the project cycle in terms of the demand-based approach, we certainly think it's important that the participation is enhanced during the project cycle. But there also needs to be a concerted effort to promote local partnerships, such as the one between different water boards, the different associations and confederation in the previous example, as well as with other institutions that can be either part of a local government structure or part of a larger water utility in the neighboring area. And certainly the challenge here is how do we synchronize timeframes so that the ongoing challenge of the electoral cycle, political cycle at all levels, including water boards, does not hamper the sustainability of the service provision that's needed. Let me move then to decentralization and municipalities, and I'll ask Liz if I think I'm at about 20 minutes, so I'll see if I can pick this up a bit. The third challenge that we highlight for the next decade has to do with making the most of decentralization in municipalities. And this is one of, I think, one of the challenges more specific to Latin America, because it speaks to the institutional, the relative institutional strength of local governments in the region, and I say that with several caveats. The most most important being that it's not all homogeneous. But there is a basis from which to build off of. And there are three important areas for this type of intervention, having to do with technical assistance, but also having to do with promotion, and also the monitoring that needs to happen after or during the operation and maintenance and replacement of the different rural systems. Certainly these are challenges that we put forth because they are pending issues that have not been fully resolved across the board. The municipalities certainly have many advantages in terms of their ability to have contact with the target population, but they are also challenged in and of themselves, and this speaks to part of this overarching challenge, which is the hardest to reach areas, which will in many cases coincide with some of the most efficient or most challenged local government structures in our countries. So some of the recommendations that have been made for addressing this challenge over the next decade have to do a lot with technical assistance. What are the resources that can be identified at the local government level for technical assistance of rural systems? How do we generate adequate monitoring systems? And I need to point out that there have been quite a few promising initiatives in the region. Brazil comes to mind. Central America comes to mind. But it's a sustainability and the ability of reaching out to all the rural system, the totality of rural systems, which is still a challenge. And so we do have something to work with, but we need to use that as a springboard for more universal monitoring and seguimiento. But this third point, I think, is perhaps the most important, which is what is the role of municipal governments in terms of helping to align local, subnational, and national stakeholders, local, subnational, and national priorities, and this is where the municipal government should be encouraged to focus its efforts, because it's certainly something that's lacking in terms of how these different interests and priorities can be more efficient and more targeted in supporting the sustainability of rural water supply and sanitation services. Let me move then to the fourth challenge, which has to do with sector and financial policies. And in this, by identifying this challenge, we're recognizing that it has been an ongoing struggle. There has not been enough progress to date in terms of national sector policies for rural systems or financial architecture in place for rural systems. And these certainly have a lot to do with how coherent and how consistent we are as a sector in many of our countries. Some of the challenges that still remain are providing predictable investment flows to rural areas. How do we encourage policies that help to align the different programs and projects that may come with external sources of funding, and so this continues to be one of the important areas that we should be working on over the next decade. example to highlight in this case is what we've seen in Nicaragua, which has been the ability to move from a status quo ante, where the focus was on the execution of works without sufficient attention to local capacity, to one where the sector is increasingly identifying ways of building local capacity by making use of decentralized institutions, i.e. local government, as well as integrating water and sanitation with hygiene promotion units. This in Nicaragua certainly is still an ongoing process, but it's a good example of the shift that's being taken in many countries, and the shift that's needed in these countries. How do we then address this? Dialogue, certainly at the national level, needs to be ongoing. Again, 22% across the region of people in Latin America continue to live in rural areas. They will continue to live in rural areas, and therefore need coherent approaches that can support the long-term sustainability of the systems that we require. And there needs to be an improved formulation of proposals from the sector, from sector specialists in many of our countries, to the decision makers. And we still need to do a better job of getting traction in this regard in many of our countries. Let me then wind up with the fifth main challenge that we see over this next decade, which has everything to do with where we see the long-term sustainability of our rural water supply and sanitation systems. We need to focus on the entirety of the issue and recognize the different dimensions that are at play. Not only the water resources, but also the quality of the service that's delivered, as well as the financial architecture that's required to support operation, maintenance, as well as replacement of systems. And in this regard, there needs to be financial management, more careful financial management and strategies for anticipating replacement and expansion costs. Many of the rural systems, as we know, do a reasonable job of focusing on operation and maintenance. A good number of the systems, up to 60% of the systems in certain countries, become obsolete after 5 or 6 years. So there is still a challenge in this operation and maintenance, but also in the importance of planning for replacement costs and replacement of hardware. There is the factor of environmental sustainability, which becomes more and more of an issue when we consider the different constraints that are appearing in different parts of the region, different climate events that are affecting our rural areas. And again, we focus on the importance of monitoring systems for local decision making, monitoring systems that can feed into and input into subnational and national decision making, in order to better target some of the technical and financial assistance that's needed to make these systems sustainable. Let me then wind up with some final thoughts, which I've tried to distill, thinking about what is some of this experience, how is this experience in this region useful for other regions. And again, this could hopefully serve as a point of reference or as a window to the future. When we think about inequity, we realize that the issue of inequity is still very much rich and poor and very much urban-rural. I make this point because I think in in the discussion that we're starting to hear more and more on the human right to water and sanitation, equity is a very important cross-cutting theme in the human right to water and sanitation. But equity it means different things for different regions. And certainly here, we're still focused on this inequity between rich and poor, income inequity, as well as urban and rural. The second point that I'd like to leave you with has to do with not only improving access, but also the need to focus on the hardest to reach. Latin America is approaching that point where many of the easier to reach populations have access or have had access in the past to services, and we need to start to recognize that there needs to be some fine-tuning of our strategies once we start to set our sights on the hardest to reach, which speaks to the last point, which again focuses on the importance of sustained quality services. In many of our countries, access does not equate to service provision or service delivery, and service delivery one day does not equate to service delivery over a sustained period. These then are the three final thoughts I'd like to leave you with, and I look forward to an engaging discussion that we can have over the next 45 minutes. Back to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I particularly appreciate one of your last points about the need not to forget about rural areas. I sometimes think that the strategies of some of these institutions is to wait for everybody to move to cities and then we'll give them water supply. Let me also quickly point out that we'll be having the UN Rapporteur for the human right to water, the human right to water on June 6th webinar. So let me introduce our first discussant, Andrew Trevitt. Andrew is a senior advisor for water, sanitation, and hygiene at UNICEF's headquarters in New York. His main areas of responsibility include support for scaling up UNICEF WASH programs through the application of evidence and good practices and capacity building. From 2006 to 2010, Andrew worked for the World Health Organization as an environmental health advisor in Bangladesh and Nepal. He was responsible for initiatives aimed at controlling environmental contaminants. Prior to his post with WHO, Andrew was a lecturer in water and sanitation at Bank-RWSN University, which we know Richard Carter last week, and Andrew managed the Masters of Science program in water supply. Andrew, I turn the microphone over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Elizabeth. Just let me know that you can hear me okay.
Sounds perfect to me. If anybody has problems, they can type in their chat box, but I think you're good to go.
Okay. Right, thank you very much, and thank you, Glenn. Good morning, Glenn, for the excellent presentation. As is always the way, you covered almost all of the points that in your presentation that I wanted to raise in terms of comments for further discussion. But also let me thank you for the paper on which your presentation was based, and I'd recommend all the participants today to have a read of that paper if they haven't done so before today. I think it's relatively rare that we see a paper that is reflecting on progress that's been made in a region, undertaking to critically review what has worked well, what hasn't, and to summarize what are the key challenges for the next decade or decades, in fact. I'd like to just make a couple of comments about the demand-based approach that you covered, Glenn. What I think the demand-based approach has been largely successful at is to embody the Dublin principles, particularly that of community participation, and trying to ensure that decisions are taken at the lowest possible level. It's also been, I think, largely successful in promoting an awareness and understanding of the economic value of water, advocating and promoting for gender, women's participation, and to some extent perhaps around sustainability and integrated water resource management. Where I think that this paradigm has been less successful and has placed much less emphasis is in identifying an approach or approaches to try to ensure that an external support mechanism is put in place such that the communities have recourse not just to technical assistance, because I think that's probably the area where they generally can manage on their own, but management and administration of services is something that's very often for rural communities a new challenge. And the demand-based approach, to me, didn't place enough emphasis on designing that component of rural water and sanitation services. I think it would be very interesting to look at the extent to which rural water services are non-functioning in Latin America. We've seen, for example, in the RWSN documents that an estimated about 1/3 of hand pumps in sub-Saharan Africa are not functioning. And I wonder whether Latin America has fared better than the African region has. I think another aspect that was touted as a feature of the demand-based approach was to give communities a real choice in deciding the technology, the level of water service that they were willing to manage and to pay for. But I think the reality has been that it's been quite rare that communities have that opportunity to select their technology. The choice is often limited by hydrological conditions, and most communities are always seeking the highest level of service, without perhaps a full realization of what it entails in terms of management and economic upkeep. I do think that there's a likelihood that in terms of sanitation technologies, we're much more likely to be able to see households, in fact, being able to select from a wide range of sanitation technologies. And I think that in part that's going to be driven by the fact that sanitation technologies, particularly in rural areas at least, are going to come under private or household ownership. The 2 points, Glenn, that I really wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about, and you have covered these in your presentation, but firstly you have highlighted the inequity that seems to be quite a feature of Latin America, and I wonder if you've uncovered any sort of underlying reasons for that inequity. Has perhaps the strong promotion of demand-based approach in Latin America encouraged a kind of survival of the fittest? And is there really a lack of some kind of social safety net in this region? So to come back to your point, how might we reach that final 10 to 15%, probably the communities in the hardest to reach parts of the country, is the most marginalized, and can they really participate in an expanded demand-based approach? And finally, the last point I'd also be very interested to hear a bit more about. You mentioned the need for financial planning around capital replacement, and also I think to some extent expansion of existing systems. Have any models been piloted or tested, and are those models ready to scale up so that we can make sure that we're not constantly in this situation of trying to reach this elusive target of universal access? I'll stop there and hand back to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I will hand it over to our second discussant, Harold. Harold holds a Master's of Science in Rural Development. His professional background is in rural water and sanitation, with a particular interest in post-implementation support and management. He has over 20 years of international work experience, focusing on institutional analysis, sector reform, and policy development, decentralization of service provision, and sustainability issues. Harold has worked in a wide range of countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, including a position in Pakistan, where he was technical advisor to the local government development department, and in Nicaragua, where he was an advisor to the National Institute for Water and Sanitation. In 2003, he established the UK consulting firm AgroConsult, which undertakes projects and assignments for a broad range of clients. Over to you, Harold. Thank you.
Okay, just to check Elizabeth on the sound, which I presume is fine.
It's fine, maybe just a tad loud if you could adjust the volume downward. Does
Okay.
anybody else think?
Let me just...
Well, that didn't work because you disappeared completely.
Okay, how does that sound?
That sounds much better for me. I hope that's okay for everybody. I hope that Bridget is happy too now. Continue.
Okay, we'll assume that Bridget is happy. I don't want to take up too much time. I realise that we don't want to run out of time for participants. And thank you, Glenn. As with Andrew, I think it's an extremely valuable input in terms of lessons and experience. And I would urge everybody to read the paper indeed. It's a great thing to see a follow-up over the long term between what was discussed 10 years ago and where we've moved to today. And what's clear from reading that paper and listening to your presentation, Glenn, is that many countries in the LAC region are really facing challenges associated with what we can refer to as mature or maturing sectors, where you've had first-time access for most, and where you're now dealing with second and even third generation investment issues. And the focus, the debate seems to be shifting much more towards addressing quality of service around long-term functionality, environmental, water source sustainability and impacts. All of that notwithstanding that I think obviously there are some significant exceptions in various sub-regions, Central America, the Andean region, where first-time access is a big challenge. It's also clear, I think, from your presentation and paper that in the LAC region, you're in the sort of vanguard of experiences with decentralization that's been going on probably longer there than most other parts of the developing world, and involvement of the private sector, amongst other issues. And I think these are very, very important lessons that you are flagging for countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where maturity of the sector is some way behind. What can we learn in a positive sense from what's worked, but also from mistakes that have been made in that region. And I think the big takeaway message for me from the presentation, the paper, is that this shift from an infrastructure focus, where in terms of increasing coverage, to addressing more permanent water service delivery is the key central challenge. And that you capture nicely, Glenn, in this phrase, going beyond the project cycle. I think that should be the takeaway message for one of the main messages for participants, that we have to start looking beyond just this initial capital construction phase or investment phase, and look at what we can do to support services in the long term. And coming out of your remarks and the challenges that you identify, I think there's a number of these essential building blocks that we can identify for sustainable services. and that revolves around professionalisation of community management, the involvement of the private sector, the support for municipal authorities, which has been problematic for a long time. How do we support those people that need to then support community management or a nascent private sector? The introduction or the emergence of regulation, even in its nascent forms. I think there are a couple of countries in Latin America where this is coming on much further than in other parts of the world. One of the issues which was less flagged in your presentation, but was certainly in the paper, was around the importance of monitoring systems. And this is again monitoring at a national scale is one of the foundational elements, I would say, of providing a sustainable service, in the sense of looking at both not only coverage issues but also the quality of those services and even the performance of the service providers. Lastly, I think what's important to flag from the Cusco Plus 10 is the emphasis you're placing on replacement and long-term costs, life cycle costs that are involved in the delivery of services. And I think it's a bold thing that you've done by explicitly meeting this issue of subsidies head on, and I think it's very important that we don't shy away from a discussion on this. And that's both subsidies in the conventional sense of initial connection, if you like, the equivalent of a connection for an urban user in terms of having the infrastructure built, but also the long-term replacement and management costs. And I think for too long this has been seen as some kind of taboo even, that we can't really tackle. So I think it's very, very important that we do raise this, and I congratulate you for that. Although I think some of the details around how those subsidies, what kind of financial mechanisms, still could be elaborated further. And just to close, to allow discussions to take place with participants, one of the issues that came across again that seems to be very central to this, but perhaps a bit harder to put our fingers on, to get our hands around, is what I would call the political economy of the rural water sector. And from my own experience, I know, thinking historically in Nicaragua, in the Dominican Republic, Honduras, El Salvador, countries like these, there's been a big struggle, a big mess, you could even say, for the rural sector reform, vis-a-vis what's been happening in the urban sector reform, where things have been much clearer, been spelt out in a more planned way, separation of functions and so on. So I guess my key question to you, Glenn, the one thing I'd like to hear more about, is what lessons have been learnt, particularly perhaps from the less aid-dependent countries in the region, about how to support this type of sector reform. What are the political processes that need to be addressed to have a clear vision for the rural sector, and as Elizabeth mentioned, that to get over this idea that the rural sector is somehow forgotten as the broader sector moves forward. Thanks very much. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Sorry, I'm coming there. Okay, well, thank you very much. Very good comments from both of our discussants. Now we come to the part of the webinar, which I'm sure you all enjoy, which is where you ask your questions and make your comments. But to start off with, Joy, could I ask you to bring out the questions that our discussants posed, and while we're waiting to get in the questions from our participants here in the chat box, we could have Glenn address those two questions. Or I guess I should say, Sujil, could you bring in the notes pod? Okay. Our this part will be of the Q&A will be facilitated by Joy and Sean. Yeah, if you could start with this question these questions from Andrew. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks. Sorry, I was trying to get our signal straight. Thanks, Andrew and Harold, for those insights and remarks. And I think it is important. I think this issue of the political economy of rural water supply and sanitation is an interesting one, and I think there are lessons that we need to be more systematic in understanding and disseminating. In particular, from those upper middle income countries that we have in the region, and I think there's certainly an opportunity to look at examples. For example, in Chile, in Brazil, although Brazil still has many challenges that it faces in rural water supply and sanitation. I'm sorry, I don't know if someone... Liz, were you talking to me?
Sorry, that was my mistake. I forgot to mute my microphone. We're having some behind-the-scenes chat here. Please go ahead. My apologies.
Okay. So I think that there certainly there certainly is a relationship between, if you remember, one of the first slides of my presentation had to do with poverty reduction, and the point on the slide is that it hides some important realities, which are that some countries have poverty rates much higher than 50%, but on the flip side, some countries have poverty rates that are lower as well, and it's in these countries where the focus has been on basic needs, unsatisfied basic needs, and a more systematic approach to targeting through programs, either rural development programs or more sector-specific programs on satisfying those basic needs. And so the triggers that I think would be helpful to identify have a lot to do with the opportunities afforded by economic growth, sustained economic growth, and we're seeing that now in countries like Peru, even countries like Bolivia are sustaining a reasonable amount of economic growth that will give them the ability to focus on some of these harder to reach rural populations. Now the political decision making that occurs, and I'd like to link this with Andrew's question, which I thought was quite thought-provoking. What are some of the underlying reasons for inequity in Latin America? I think has as much to do with the evolution of the development in the region around primary cities, and so the focus on feeding the metropolis, as opposed to recognizing the importance for development in decentralized development throughout the countries, and I think this plays out quite systematically in most of the countries of the region, and one of the consequences of that is certainly this urban-rural disparity that exists, and so this, I think, is also gives us some at least an understanding of why it is where we are, where there is where it has been difficult to place more emphasis on rural development, on rural water supply sanitation in our countries, as we start looking forward to increased competitiveness and productive uses of rural economies. I think we may have an opportunity for revisiting or for framing that discussion. There are a couple more questions that I'm seeing popping up on my screen,
Yes,
but Elizabeth,
yes.
I don't know if you want me to jump into those or if you'd like.
I'm going to turn it over to Sean, and
Or if you'd like Joy to read them, or
Joy and
Or
Sean
Sean.
are going to be working together about this, so they will be bringing out questions for you one at a time. And I'll just turn this over to Joy and Sean. Sean, if you want to read out the questions so that everybody can focus on the one. And if something is not for Glenn but is for one of our discussions, could you please make that clear? Thank you. Take it away, Sean.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, Glenn. It's and hello, everyone. The first question is from Arto in Ethiopia, and he'd like a little bit more detail on the subsidy policies and funding mechanisms and how you see them as a challenge over the next decade.
Okay. I did see that message or that question typed up during the discussion. I think the challenge for identifying I think the challenge, we can break down the challenge into two different parts. One is, how do we design appropriate subsidies, i.e. what are we subsidizing, how much, and how are we targeting them? And that certainly speaks to the strength or the need for a stronger sector presence in many of our countries in terms of focusing on rural water supply and sanitation. Now, the design, the targeting of the different subsidies that will need to be considered for not only construction but also for replacement, as well as provision of technical assistance and software, is balanced by the second component that I see, which is how do we implement that, or how do we finance that? And in this regard, there are opportunities I see in the region for tapping into not only national but also subnational and local institutions and their budget planning processes. One of the points made in the challenge on decentralization and municipalities pointed precisely to the opportunity for identifying some resources at the municipal level that could contribute to some of these policies, but then we need a very clear subsidy policy to be designed by the sector in that case. So I see those as being some of the subcomponents of this challenge to subsidies for rural water supply sanitation. And the final point to make on this is, again, the importance of and the lack of systematic information, which again swings back or links us back to the importance of monitoring systems, which again it was also raised by other discussed by Harold and in the presentation as something that still has not been resolved sufficiently in Latin America. Back to you, Sean.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Sorry, the next question that came up, Glenn, was to what extent does corruption affect equitable access to water in Latin America?
To what extent does corruption affect equitable access to water in Latin America? I think that's a fair question, and again, it's difficult. It's difficult to address across the entire region, and so this is where some nuancing or some trends can come in. I think an appropriate way of looking at the issue of corruption is in terms of resource allocation at the outset to the operation and maintenance and expansion of systems at the community or local level. And I think the bottlenecks at both of those levels have a lot to do with the type of transparent or not transparent processes under which the decisions are being made. In terms of the degree of how much it affects equitable access to water supply in Latin America, I think you can make an argument that there are institutionalized practices that are not transparent that are affecting to a certain degree equitable access of water in Latin America, and I would untangle that question or that level of decision making in terms of linking that to its impact to equitable access.
Great, thank you very much. The next question that thank you, Glenn, is about the concept of the water safety plan, and to what extent do you think that this concept is being introduced into Latin American countries?
I'm familiar with the water safety plan or the water safety planning that OPS has been supporting and has been implementing in different parts of the region. I'm aware of a few cases in Central America, in Honduras in particular, which come to mind. And I'm not. I haven't seen any scaled up version or any scaled up experience on water safety planning. So I think that there still are opportunities there. At the same time, I think that while water safety planning is a very integrated way of looking at availability of resources, delivery of water supply, treatment of wastewater. I think one of the challenges has been how do we shift the paradigm in terms of working across different subsectors in particular countries. So these discussions go well beyond service providers, have to involve other types of water users, and certainly need to involve decision makers from outside the sector. And so that, if anything, that has been, I think, the hurdle that has been limiting the wider proliferation of water safety planning. Back to you, Sean.
Great, thank you, Glenn. The next question is, you were talking about the challenge being getting to the last 10 to 15% of the population. What role, if any, do you think self-supply has, and how do you think government could facilitate self-supply as a means to reaching the most hard to reach?
Self-supply in Latin America will I think be useful when we're talking about dispersed rural populations. For many of the majority of rural populations, which are concentrated, certainly the preferred option, or the option that is most driven by demand are pipe systems. And so when we start talking about self-supply, I think we're targeting certainly some of the dispersed rural communities, and this is where I think we need to get a better handle on costs in terms of how government or how the public sector starts to address the viability, the economic viability of self-supply to these dispersed rural populations. There seems to be still a focus on the concentrated rural populations, and so I would link this, or I would include this in the challenge of the political economy of rural water supply and sanitation, to even go further and say, okay, what is needed in concentrated versus dispersed populations. So I do see that as a pending issue for many of our countries.
Yes, I believe that Harold wanted to add something on that point. Harold, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks Elizabeth. Just by way of contributing to what Glenn's already said, I think it's important to point out, for example, in the USA, that about 14 million people are served by effectively what is self-supply. So it's a very important part of the puzzle, if you like. I know from my time working in Nicaragua that in some of the higher coverage level municipalities, the agency was looking at ways of addressing the last mile, if you like, or the last few percentage of households that were very difficult to reach or very costly to reach. But I think one of the main points is if self-supply is not recognised or part of the government policy, then it's unlikely to be addressed in a systematic, in a substantial way. So I think really putting it back on the policy debate and the dialogue is an important part of addressing this approach to serving some of the hardest to reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. The next question that we have is for Glenn is, how do you think that we can effectively deal with the low level of policy enforcement? An example here is given of Mexico, which is a relatively rich economy, with a very comprehensive body of policies regulating wastewater treatment, but the questioner feels that only a fraction of the wastewater is actually treated. So, well, how do we deal with this gap between good policy and bad practice?
Yes, in Spanish we have a saying that says el papel puede aguantar mucho, which is the written word can say just about anything, and so I think this is a reasonable point as far as situations where we do have quite extensive policies and guidelines, but are not being implemented. The thought that I would have in terms of the question, and in particular also with this example, is that many of the enforcement to the policies have, in my view, have as much to do with decision making and systems outside of the water and sanitation sector as they do with forces or with decision makers within the water and sanitation sector. And so part of the approach that the water and sanitation program has been taking has been identifying how to generate evidence that's helpful for policymakers external to the water and sanitation sector, i.e. ministries of finance, ministries of environment, ministries of health, education, where there can be a bit more traction on some of the enforcement of these important policies, making these issues a priority for others, not only for the sector professionals and for the sector decision makers, is vitally important. And I think you'll find for those countries where there has been quite a jump in wastewater treatment, for example, has been due oftentimes to economic interests as much as for environmental, health-related, or sector interests. So breaking out of this stovepipe of the water sanitation sector, I think is extremely important in that regard. Back to you, Sean.
Great. Okay. Well, it's you're nearly off the hook now. But last question, I think. Are there any successful examples of public-private partnerships in rural water supply in Central and Latin America that you could share with us?
I think certainly there are any number of good examples, and I'll predicate that with saying that it depends how broad how broad a definition we're using for public-private partnerships, because certainly there are many small specialized operators who are providing services to different water committees or water boards in terms of operating and maintaining their systems, and this can be found in any number of countries. I mean, they're certainly community-based. There are specialized operators that are at play, and certainly there are also some other ways that the private sector has been contributing in terms of financing, for example, or providing financial products to households for basic sanitation, for example, and this has been quite successful in certain countries in Peru, for example. We've seen quite an uptake in that approach.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for that. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, we have to close in order to keep to our deadline. If you could take away this note spot now, Soo-Jung, I will be able to thank everyone for their participation today. First, of course, thanks to all of you who have joined us. I noticed by the end we're up to 72 participants from around the world. So thank you for taking the time to type in all of those questions and comments. Clearly we couldn't get to most of them. We will provide a written copy of all of your questions and comments to Glenn. He doesn't know this, but perhaps we can prevail on him to provide a written answer to some more of your questions, and we will post those on the website if we can get it. Thank you, Glenn, for your presentation, and thank you, Andrew and Harold, for your comments. Thank you, Sean and Joy and Kirsten and Agnes, for all of your facilitating, and thank you, Army, for your technical support. And finally, thanks to Soo-Jung for managing the Adobe Connect for us so wonderfully. As I said at the outset, you'll all be getting an email from us by tomorrow at the latest about next week's webinar. And in that email, you will see this big green Get More Information button. So if you click that, you will find recordings of this and last week's webinars, and you will also find Glenn's PowerPoints and the WSP publication to which he refers. So, once again, thank you all. I hope to see you next week when Terry Barbot will be speaking about African rural water supply. And hope to see you then next Tuesday. Bye.